Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian, and in today's episode, I'm doing another cEDH player reviews game series. So, once again, the point of this series is to use featured gameplay from awesome channels, like, for example, today's video, Playing with Power, and use those gameplay as teaching tools and instruments so that people can get better at playing cEDH and better at the game. Now, this particular episode, I was really excited about recording because this episode is featuring a deck that, so I built this list as one of my options for a Brewer's Choice episode that I worked on with the Mind Sculptors. I ended up not submitting that as my deck for that episode. And what I ended up doing was just sort of having this deck in the background. And then Mikey, who y'all may remember from the Armix Crom episode, Mikey's a very prolific member of the community, also happens to be a patron of Playing with Power at the tier in which he can submit decks to be played on the channel. So Mikey reached out to me and said, "Hey Ian, I have a need for some spicy decks to make Zach from Playing with Power play in this next episode. What do you got for me?" So then I submitted my Sisay list, and we're gonna take a little look at this Sisay list right now. So this is my list, El Capitan. It is a Sisay list, and the entire point of it was to build a Sisay Gigantha combo so that as soon as Gigantha activated for the first time, you would be able to get a loop going in which you'd be able to just tutor out a bunch of planeswalkers that all untapped or like made copies of Gigantha and assemble enough mana so that you can infinitely use the Chain Veil over and over again, and then using an ability like Gaia Drone Delhada, you'd be able to plus and drain each opponent for 2, or use the Healy Rise uptick to just deal 1 damage to every opponent. So basically the whole point of the deck is to make infinite activations of the Chain Veil and kill your opponents that way. The rest of the deck is pretty stacks heavy. It's very Rule of Law heavy specifically. You have Eidolons and Archons and all of that nonsense, Deafening Silence, things like that. And then a lot of ways to give Gigantha haste so that you can play Gigantha and win that turn basically. So the deck sort of becomes like 5-color Planeswalker Godo, which is pretty funny. And yeah, it's a really fun deck. I'm really like proud of it. It gets to play some cool stacks pieces, but the deck was like 93% a meme. This Force of Will is actually an error. That is supposed to be a Pact of Negation because you cannot play Force of Will with Gigantha, which they did fix for the episode. So it's not like Zach was playing with an invalid list. But the deck's super cool. I was really proud of making it, and it does some spicy stuff when it gets going. And you get to play Planeswalkers, which are my favorite card type in all of Magic, and like traditionally do not see a lot of play in cEDH. So all of that to say, the list is pretty cool, and I'm very excited and glad to get to show it off in this gameplay episode. So let's jump back to Playing with Power. So anyways, I'm going to be watching this episode of Playing with Power. I'm only going to watch the first game because, spoilers, you get to see the deck do its thing. And I'll be going through the game, sort of commenting on stuff as it's going on and talking about what leads eventually to a victory. Yeah.
So let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Mike piloting Halar the Fire Fletcher. This deck, submitted by patron Jordan, aims to leverage its commander's ability in conjunction with kick spells to burn out the table.
I would consider the potential of this commander to ever go above the high power realm, but it's a cool card and it's definitely interesting to see. But as I said, I think the power level of this list is a little lower than I think the average cEDH pod.
Opening hand contains a command tower, Forest, Dockside Extortionist, Mox Diamond, Wild Growth, here, right? Emerald Charm, and a Circle of Dreams Druid. Next, we have Ryan piloting Grand Arbiter Augustin IV. This deck, submitted by patron Rio, seeks to mill out his opponents by leveraging Persistent Petitioners. Ryan's opening hand
so
contains
another
an
strategy
Tomb,
here definitely that I think is definitely more for the gimmick. It's obviously like cool to have a patron, submit a unique list like this, but once again, I don't know if we quite venture into the cEDH territory with the Persistent Petitioners gimmick.
Spell, Persistent Petitioners, Cavern of Souls, Island, Dramatic Reversal, and a Mental Misstep.
Clunky hand
After that, we have Zach piloting Sisay, Weatherlight Captain, with Gigantha the Wellspring as the companion. This deck, submitted by patron Mikey and built by Comedian MTG, leverages Gigantha in order to activate Sisay to tutor out Planeswalkers and win with a Planeswalker-focused combo. Zach's opening hand contains an Arid Mesa, Gaia's Cradle, Mana Crypt, Archon of Emeria.
So already, I mean, this hand sets Zach up for such success throughout this game, right? Because if you go get a plateau with that Arid Mesa, you're able to go turn 1 Archon of Emeria, and then turn 2, you can play Xenagos. You can use that to make more mana. You know, being able to Xenagos, hit the 0 ability, make a creature next turn between Cradle and Xenagos' Xenagos' +1 ability, which is basically a Cradle also. You're making a ridiculous amount of mana as soon as you untap this deck. So being able to go turn 1 Archon, turn 2 Xenagos, turn 3, be able to... I think you can get and play Giganta that turn, because that's 4... Being able to have Giganta and then untap, play Sisay, and then have Giganta without Summoning Sickness is obviously the way you get to the win. So it's pretty cool.
Sylvan Library, Imperial Seal, and
Sylvan Library and
Xenagos the
Imperial
Reveler.
Seal,
Finally, we have Cal,
awesome cards.
piloting Oswald Fiddlebender. This deck, submitted by patron Alex, stacks us out the board and tutors up a combo using its commander. Cal's opening hand contains a Hope of Gearper, Mana Crypt, Jeweled Amulet, Snow-Covered Plains, Archon of Emeria, Mirror Retriever, and
another turn 1 Archon
Without further
hand.
ado,
Seems
let's
pretty
kick off
good.
this dramatic dictation of these dueling...
Unfortunately, I think for Cal in this game, being stuck behind the Archon puts you in a bit of a sorry position for that turn 1 ramp, unfortunately.
decks. Mike wins the You, Me, and Dupree challenge and gets to start us off. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a command tower. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Snow-Covered Forest. He casts a Wild Growth on his command tower.
Yeah,
Mike passes.
So obviously
Ryan
a really
draws a
good
card for turn
start
and plays
there.
an island. He ends his turn. Zach draws and plays a Temple Garden into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Crypt.
And this is kind of what I was talking about when we looked at Ryan's hand there for a second. If you notice, like, or even just seeing what your opponents are doing in this first rotation of the table, Island Pass doesn't really stand up to, you know, Mox Diamond, Wild Growth on a land, Crypt into an Archon, like things like that. So, you know, as I said, even though the individual decks we're evaluating, they're built to try and compete in a cEDH setting, right? So if we're evaluating the pace of this game, keeping a hand that really doesn't do anything except for like play a Petitioner turn 2 with a Cavern of Souls seems very, very slow for a cEDH game, even for a deck that is maybe lagging a little behind. You might even want more acceleration because you have to compensate for the fact that your deck is kind of doing something a little more fringe.
He casts an Archon of Emeria. The table groans as they now know it's going to be one of those games,
one of those
and
cards that
Zach
shapes
passes
the game
turn.
immediately.
Cal draws
right?
and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts a Mana Crypt. Cal passes.
Yep, so
Mike
that's Cal's
draws and
one
plays
per
a
turn,
Snow-Covered
like we talked
Forest.
about
He
beforehand.
casts Circle of Dreams Druid. Mike ends his turn. Ryan
So
draws
Mike's
and plays
just got a ridiculous amount of mana, but in the command zone, you don't really get a lot of card advantage, so it's hard to like filter that mana into anything when your hand's not doing anything else.
an Ancient Tomb into play tap through Archon. Ryan gets a turn
Ryan's
to
getting
Zach.
uber punished here
During his
too,
upkeep,
for
Zach
sure.
loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts his commander, Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. He plays a Gaia's Cradle for turn. He moves to combat.
Now, so we're immediately seeing the effects of Zach's fetch on that first turn. If he had gotten a green-red source, i.e. Taiga, it would have enabled him to be able to... Oh, that wouldn't have enabled him to play... Or so I guess he would have had to get a Plateau, which I believe the deck is running, and now I'm questioning myself. It is running it. So that's kind of why I mentioned the Plateau play on turn 1, because if Zach gets a Plateau here, you can play turn 1 Archon, and then because Archon's in the field, Cradle taps for a green, and you go 1, 2, 3, 4 with the red mana there, play Xenagos, which I think ends up, or I would suspect to be a much more optimized play than jamming out Sisay this early, because curving Xenagos into the next turn Jeggy, into being able to play Sisay and then activate Jeggy that turn, I think it's a lot more effective than the curve that's happening right now. So you can see in games where fetching the right color mana can actually be pretty relevant. And it's not like, you know, if this was an Archon of effect, like a Rule of Law effect, you could use the 2 mana here to play Sylvan Library, but unfortunately that's not the case. And so kind of sequencing it this way, the fetch target gets a little punished.
And attacks Mike with Archon. Mike takes it, and Zach shifts the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts his commander, Oswald Fiddlebender. Cal passes.
Now, we see in this game that Oswald clearly meant to play under Rule of Law effects, right? If you think about Birthing Pod effects, it's like one of the best parity breakers under Rule of Law. Hence decks like Blue Pod or my Kenrith Pod list. So Oswald being an artifact pod effect, obviously is going to be able to take a decent amount of advantage of the fact that everyone else is locked to 1 spell per turn when Oswald basically doubles the amount of actions you can take per turn. Not to mention things that untap and allow you to use it multiple times for sure.
The turn. Mike draws and also casts his commander, Halar the Fire Fletcher. Mike passes. Ryan draws and plays a Plains. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast his commander, Grand Arbiter Augustin IV.
Yeah, this game's
Ryan gives the turn to Zach.
Down.
During his upkeep, Zach loses.
Another reason where I think Xenagos would have been really good here, because Xenagos plus Gaia's Cradle is really allowing you to start making kind of ridiculous amounts of mana that allows you to bust through the ceiling of Grand Arbiter's taxing.
Uses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts Xenagos, the Reveler.
Yeah,
he activates Xenagos' first ability, adding 2 red. He buys Gigantha, putting it into his hand from outside the game. Seconds his turn. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Hope of Girapur. He activates Oswald.
So what we're going to see here is if Gigantha comes down this next turn, it is going to be immediately slower. So he would have had 8 mana this turn, because if you drop in Xenagos, 0 ability, make a 2/2. Xenagos makes 2 here, Cradle makes 2 here, and the rest of the lands make 4. So that's 8 mana, which is enough to buy and play Gigantha. So if Sisay was not cast last turn and Xenagos was cast instead, you have exactly enough mana to buy and play Gigantha out of the companion zone. And then next turn, you just play Sisay out of the command zone, go off. But now he has Gigantha in hand without haste, which slows down the combo a turn.
Ability, sacrificing Hope of Girapur, and fetching up.
So I don't know the exact configuration of the Oswald list, but a 1-drop here in my instinct is really good, because I believe there are a number of untappers for 2 mana that could be really
But Marble
helpful.
Diamond onto the battlefield tap.
Marble Diamond
Cal
was not
gives
what
the
I was
turn to
expecting.
Mike. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Xenagos with Halar. Xenagos takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Mike creates 3 treasures. Mike ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Misty Rainforest into play tapped. He casts Persistent Petitioners. Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt.
Now, the Petitioner's deck especially gets hyper punished by playing under this rule of law, because obviously that deck is about mass advantage, right? You want as many Petitioners as possible on the battlefield so you can start doing its thing. But under a rule of law effect, this deck is really punished because you are stuck to playing a single copy of Petitioners every single turn, and having Grand Arbiter in the command zone really doesn't change much for you. So it's definitely a very punishing position for that deck.
Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it and pays a life. In response, Mike casts Beast Within, targeting Sisay. Sisay is destroyed, and Zach creates a 3/3 beast. Then Zach fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield.
We see there, despite the line we talked about with having Jeggy with haste this turn, or not haste specifically, but without Summoning Sickness, the combo still wouldn't have been able to go off, because it's a sorcery speed combo, and the fact that, by the time you go to cast Sisay out of the command zone, Jeggy gets Beast Within here. So definitely ends up actually rewarding Zach for the sequencing, because Gigantha is much harder to get back than Sisay is. So that ends up being pretty cool here.
He activates Xenagos' second ability, creating a 2/2 satyr with haste. He casts Sylvan Library and gives the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Mirror Retriever. He activates Oswald's ability, sacrificing Mirror Retriever. Retriever triggers, and Cal returns Hope of...
I gotta say, I love these, fiddly decks, and I don't have any other way to describe them apart from fiddly, but Fiddlebender is kind of funny. I didn't even think about that. But the idea that you go, okay, I'm going to play this artifact, and I'm going to sacrifice that artifact, and I'm going to bring this artifact back, and the classic KCI modern loops. I mean, KCI was atrocious at the time in modern, but these style of decks are just super interesting, and I find that they play really unique lines. And if you learn them really well, things like Teshar, and with really, really skilled Teshar pilots and things in that nature, getting to know these little intricacies of obviously Cal is playing someone else's list right now, so doesn't know all of the deep intricacies of this list, but being able to do all these little fiddly artifact things and can gain a ton of value over time, and once again through a rule of law, which is kind of cool.
Of Girapur to his hand. Then Cal fetches up a Scrap Trawler onto the battlefield. Cal passes, discarding to hand size. Mike draws and casts Sylvan Library. Mike passes.
Sylvan Library game.
Ryan draws and plays Cavern of Souls into play tapped, naming Advisor as it enters. Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he draws 2 additional through Sylvan Library, putting 2 back on top. He plays a Wooded...
Now, it's interesting to note here that despite my previous comments about Halar, it is really good against Zach in this pod because of the fact that Zach has a Mana Crypt and a Sylvan Library going. The fact that Cal has a Mana Crypt on the battlefield, and the fact that Ryan is hypothetically would be consistently using the Ancient Tomb. Hasn't used it a ton, to be honest, during this game. But everyone's life total is under a decent amount of pressure here, so there is a certain level of advantage Halar has given the progression of how the plays have played out in this pod.
Foothills for turn. He activates Xenagos' first ability, adding 3 red. He casts Ral Zarek. In response, Ryan cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield.
One thing that's kind of funny to note is that, like, Zach is doing a lot of, like, middling value stuff here with Planeswalkers. The longer the board gets kind of stalled out with Planeswalkers on the battlefield specifically, they end up being really fantastic grind engines. So, like, if Xenagos isn't taken care of after a certain while, I mean, first of all, it's acting as a guy's cradle every single turn. And the fact that Ral comes down, it's going to start tapping things and untapping things, and eventually it's just going to start flipping coins and taking extra turns, which is obviously really, really strong, because it goes off 2 turns after you have it. I guess technically 3, because you need an uptick, and then -7. But it's just worth noting that despite Planeswalkers being weaker in the format, you do need to still pressure them. They're weaker because you can't pressure them, but because of the way this deck is actually playing out in this current pod, and because you have a decent amount of creatures in the list, you can protect your Planeswalkers. And Planeswalkers are way better when they're not being attacked. The weakness in cEDH is that people can attack them over and over again, but if you have ways to protect them, they get way better. One of the reasons that Tevesh can often take over games is the fact that it making the 2 thralls every turn, yes, by attacking them, they're losing thralls that could be being sacrificed, but at the same time, people have to keep jamming their creatures into Devesh over and over and over again, and a lot of the times, people can't afford to just keep attacking the same person over and over and over, because eventually they play a blocker. They can start taking creatures away, and then the Planeswalker runs away with the game. That's why when Tevesh first came out, you heard tons of people being like, yeah, I just got lost to a Tevesh ultimate. Maybe I only heard about these, but I heard a lot of games like that when Devesh first came out, which kind of was one of the main things that turned people on to Devesh in the first place.
He casts Counterspell, countering Ral Zarek. With nothing else, Zach passes to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses.
Despite everything I said before, I don't get why that was the target for Counterspell here. I don't think it was like a game-winning move, and now Ryan's tapped out a counter magic for the rest of the table. So using a Counterspell here when there are 2 more players left in the rotation of the table, and it may just be because Zach looks pretty far ahead with multiple advantage engines on the board, but I'd be curious to hear Ryan's thoughts about why he counterspelled that threat in particular.
This is his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a snow-covered plains. He casts Jeweled Amulet. He activates Oswald, sacrificing Jeweled Amulet, and fetches up an Expedition map onto the battlefield. He cracks his Expedition map. Scrap Trawler triggers, and Cal returns Jeweled Amulet to his hand.
It's all
then
this
Cal
cute
fetches
stuff,
up
man.
a Mutavault into his hand. Cal ends his turn. During his draw step, Mike draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life.
So, for anyone confused about that particular play pattern, Mutavault with Book of Exalted Deeds, you put the Exalted Deeds onto the Mutavault, which is an angel technically, because Mutavault is every creature type, and it prevents you from losing or your opponent's winning and you losing the game. So that's what Cal is slowly building up to, is the ability to not die, basically.
To keep them both. In his main phase, he casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Dockside Extortionist, and fetching up a Yisan the One.
Which I don't know what the exact win condition of Oswald is, but Cal going for that line after already seeing that there's a beast within in Mike's deck, because usually, lands are something very hard to target for a lot of decks. But knowing that Mike's deck has a beast within, and at any time he could just Eternal Witness it back, or, Noxious Revival it back to the top of his library, means that I don't know that the Book of Exalted Deeds line is the one to go for. Once again, I don't know the exact win conditions in Oswald, but I assume a proactive combo as opposed to a defensive combo would be more relevant in this pod. Also, for those who haven't played against Yisan in a Rule of Law pod, Yisan's stupid. Yisan is stupidly powerful if there are Rule of Laws on the table. It is one of the most powerful cards at punishing tables that I've played a bunch of stacks effects. And I'm pausing here because now I'm realizing that maybe I should be testing this Yisan in my Kenrith pod list, because Kenrith being able to give Yisan haste is pretty hot. Unrelated to this game whatsoever, just think that's a pretty cool interaction. All right, let's go back to it.
Wanderer Bard onto the battlefield. Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Ryan activates his Petitioners, milling himself for 1. Ryan draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns into play tapped.
I'm confused as to why Ryan's milling himself here.
Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra.
Yeah.
In his main phase, he activates Xenagos' first ability, adding 3 red. He recasts his commander, Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. He activates Sisay, fetching up Oko, Thief of Crowns, onto the battlefield.
Yeah, so that's another thing with that I really like about this deck is that at some point you just get a stupid amount of mana to where you can just manually activate Sisay. And then you start doing broken stuff like just pulling creatures, legendary creatures, and planeswalkers out of your deck turn after turn after turn after turn, playing through Rule of Laws, and just doing dumb stuff like playing Oko and nuking people's commanders, and or what I would assume is Yisan here. I'm not a gambling man, but Yisan would be my target here. Just because that card, as I mentioned, is insanely scary in Rule of Law pods.
He activates Oko's second ability, turning Mike's Halar into a 3/3 elf.
Halar,
Zach shifts the turn
I would
to
definitely
Cal.
hit Yisan, but
During his upkeep, Cal loses his
here.
mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Mutavault into play tapped. He casts Consecrate Land, targeting Mutavault.
So, this is a preventative measure to talk against what we were just talking about with Beast Within. So now we see Consecrate Land being a countermeasure to the Beast Within play I talked about.
Ryan, knowing what Cal's about to do, responds by paying 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Consecrate Land.
Snipes that,
Cal passes.
That obviously
At the end of Cal's turn,
problematic.
Mike casts Inscription of Abundance, having Halar and Archon fight one another.
Now, I have to double check Oswald here, but I'm pretty sure Oswald can only activate at sorcery speed? Yeah. So I'm interested in Al's choice here to not activate Oswald at all during this play pattern. Like, I don't really think you need a Marble Diamond unless for some reason... Oh, I guess you do need triple white for the Book of Exalted Deeds, but I don't know. It feels like passing up an Oswald activation that could be furthering your game plan seems a little like it's bringing you farther and farther behind your opponents.
Archon dies, the table cheers, and Mike moves to his turn. During his draw step, Mike draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. He plays...
Now, that play is super interesting to me because, as I mentioned, Yisan is busted underneath an Archon of Emeria. So unless Mike's about to just hard pop off right now, I would be keeping that Archon around. And, like, if anything, I'd be protecting that Archon if I was a Yisan player right now. Obviously, Sisay does... My instinct as Mike, if I was in his position, would be to use the Inscription to actually fight Sisay so that I would be the only one breaking parity on the current table with Archon. However, that also means that you have to think about putting pressure on Oko so that you're not getting your Yisan Oko'd. So there's a couple of little balance things there, but I definitely think hitting the Archon is not the play I would have gone for in this pod.
Plays a War Room for turn. He activates Yisan the Wanderer Bard, getting a verse counter, and fetching up a Quirion Ranger onto the battlefield. He floats a green, then activates Quirion Ranger, returning Snow-Covered Forest to his hand, untapping Yisan. He activates Yisan, getting a verse counter, and fetches up a Scrib Ranger onto the battlefield. Then Mike taps his creature to help convoke Court of Calling, where X equals 5. In response, Ryan casts Flusterstorm, with all copies, being only 1 copy, targeting Cord. Cord is countered, and Mike passes the turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Ryan activates Petitioners, milling himself for 1. Ryan draws and transmutes Muddle the Mixture, fetching up a Pull from Tomorrow into his hand. Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Zach wins his mana crypt roll. During his draw step, he draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. In his main phase, he plays a Plateau for turn. He activates Xenagos' first ability, adding 3 red. He casts Sneak Attack. The table looks for...
So, for those who are unfamiliar with this deck... Sneak Attack is the best card in the deck, by far. It allows you to break through Rule of Law effects and get your Hasty Gigantha. So it turns your combo to play Sneak Attack, and then you go 3 mana, put Jeggy in hand, pay 1 red, Sneak Attack, let's do the whole combo. It's so good. Sneak Attack in this deck is so good. I think, Sneak Attack with any Gigantha Sisay deck is really good. It's really good in all Rebels variants. It's really good in this one. Sneak Attack is also a card I just absolutely adore in general, and I think... I want more ways to play it in cEDH. I love it so much. It's such a fun card. Yeah, hey, leave comments down below, people, if you think of really cool things we can do with Sneak Attack in the format. I know people used to play it with Protean Hulk, and I think that's probably something that we could mess around with. So I'd love to hear down below people commenting on Sneak Attack value. It's such a fun card, such a cool. I love red cards. That's such like the iconic. Boom, drop a fatty, 1 mana, let's go, mono red. It's gone the end turn, doesn't matter. All right, I'm done with my Sneak Attack rant. Anyways. Let's see Zach pop off.
For answers, but no one has any, and Sneak Attack resolves.
This is basically
Zach activates Sneak Attack, putting Gigantha onto the battlefield with haste. He taps Gigantha and activates Sisay, fetching up a Teferi Time Raveler onto the battlefield.
So Zach has the luxury here of, once again, Archon's gone, right? So Zach can play any number of spells, and the ability to go grab Teferi here, which I want to be super clear, is only ever good in Sisay decks. Because Teferi, other than that, has to be a grand abolish. It's like a defense grid, right? You don't play defense grid unless you're going to win the game. Which Teferi Time Raveler is really, really cool with Sisay because it is a tutorable defense grid. Awesome in the deck, right? Not great if you're not playing specifically Sisay with the ability to tutor it out of the library. Because it's 3 mana, and that's a bit of an investment. But Zach has a really cool option here to be able to go, okay, activate my commander, go get this defense grid, or basically silence for the whole table, and now I'm confident in my win here.
He activates Sneak Attack, putting Bloom Tender onto the battlefield with haste. He activates Sisay, fetching up Teferi, who slows the Sunset onto the battlefield.
This is where the degenerates
He taps Gaia's
start.
Cradle for 5, then activates Teferi, who slows the Sunset's first ability, untapping Gaia's Cradle, Mana Crypt, and Giganta.
So this point in the combo, you're going to start seeing just a bunch of Planeswalkers pulled out. And the important part is all of these Planeswalkers have the ability to either make a copy of or untap Gigantha. And obviously the copies will have to have haste. And the whole point is you're assembling enough mana so that by the time the Oath of Teferi comes out, you're doing all of this all over again. And by the time Chain Veil comes out, you're just winning the game with this. And you're going to start seeing these.
He taps Gigantha and activates Sisay, fetching up Kiora, Behemoth Beckoner, onto the battlefield.
Here's an untapper.
He activates Kiora's first ability, untapping Gigantha.
And the cool part about this whole combo is all of these untappers also, so if you're not in a position which is developed as Zach is, where you don't have as many legendary permanents with colors on them, a lot of these Planeswalkers have, for example, like Kiora is you need 2 other colors with Sisay, but it is able to, now you have green blue, and that's allowing you to continue up the chain of Sisay. Now, once again, Zach has a bunch of permanents on the battlefield, so it doesn't really matter at this point. But in general, it's good to know if anyone ever wants to pick up this deck, which I highly recommend because it is so much fun. And I'll leave it down in the show notes below. It's gimmicky and it's quirky, but it's a really fun deck.
And activates Sisay, fetching up Kiora, Master of Depths, onto the battlefield.
Another untapper.
He floats 5 green from Cradle, then activates Kiora, Master of Depths, untapping Gaia's Cradle and Gigantha. He taps Gigantha to activate Sisay, tutoring up Gehedron Dihada onto the battlefield.
So Gehedron is what I talked about. The important part here is that the uptick is a win condition, and the downtick is a threat in effect, i.e. you can take a creature, give it haste, and it's under your control till the end turn, except for it doesn't have to be an opponent's creature. So you can gain control of your own Gigantha, and which untaps it.
He activates Gehedron's second ability, targeting Gigantha, putting a corruption counter on it, and untapping it.
Yep.
He taps Gigantha to activate Sisay, fetching up a Saheeli Ray onto the battlefield.
Yep. And here's
he
what I was talking
activates
about with the
Saheeli's
clone
second
of it.
ability, creating a copy of Gigantha with haste, sacrificing the original. He taps Gigantha to activate Sisay, fetching up an Oath of Teferi onto the battlefield, allowing Zach to activate his Planeswalkers a second time.
Now, this Oath of Teferi is one of the most important pivot points if you're not as developed as Zach is. Now, Zach's already floating a silly amount of mana. And once again, that's because he has Cradle already on the battlefield and he has Xenagos already on the battlefield. But if you were to do this chain sort of from the beginning, Oath of Teferi is kind of the piece that allows you to go from, all right, I'm just untapping using Gigantha, but I'm not netting anything. Oath of Teferi is the one that says, like, all right, but now they're all doing all of those upticks and all of those abilities all over again, which allows you to gain just a silly amount of value.
This turn. He floats mana from Cradle, then activates Kiora, Master of Depths, untapping Gigantha and Cradle. He taps Gigantha and activates Sisay, fetching up a Chain Veil onto the battlefield.
So now we clearly have a demonstratable way in which there are a few Planeswalkers on the battlefield right now that for a single activation can net enough mana to get Chain Veil going. Now, clearly we have Teferi, who slows the Sunset, who is able to untap the Chain Veil itself, and that's what's going to keep this engine going right now.
Zach presents a loop of activating Chain Veil, giving each Planeswalker an additional activated ability this turn, then using Teferi, who slows the Sunset, to untap Chain Veil, Gaia's Cradle, and Mana Crypt. With this loop,
there was a small correction there. You can't untap Chain Veil and Mana Crypt, but Gaia's Cradle does more than enough work here.
He can activate his Planeswalkers infinite times. He activates Saheeli Ray's first ability over and over, dealing damage to each opponent until they are dead.
You can use Saheeli Ray there, or you can all use Gehedron Dihada.
And Zach wins the game. Wow, what an amazing game. The Archon of Emeria really did work this game, and the rest of the table wants another crack at it, so they go again. In this game,
So that's the one game I'm going to show, because this one video is already already almost a half an hour. So That's one game I wanted to show. I really, really, really am proud of that deck. I think it's so fun. I was really happy when Mikey reached out to me asking for a spicy list. I was really happy that I bumped into this list again and was like, oh, this is absolutely what has to be played on the channel. And I love that the first game displayed with it ended up being a victory for this deck. It's a little fringe, obviously, but it's also like 5-color Godo in a sense, which is kind of cool. It's a really fun deck to play. I advise anyone looking for a deck that works on a very unique axis in cEDH to check out the deck, because it's very, very funny, very spicy, and I'm really proud of how it came out. So it's a cool list, and I encourage people to check it out. Thank you for playing with Power, for always being really cool about me using their footage for these videos, and thank you for watching these videos. As I mentioned, they're always meant to be instructional for helping people learn and grow as players. I would love to hear what you guys think of the list down in the comments below, if you have any of that sneak attack spice that I talked about earlier in the episode. And I'm always looking for suggestions for games that people want me to analyze on this series. I think it's really important that people really bring up times what they want, you know, a deeper dive into gameplay and things like that, and I'm happy to provide those instances. So if anyone wants to mention any specific games you want me to analyze, throw those down in the comments down below. Before we go, I just want to remind you to hit like and subscribe if you enjoy videos like this, and if you're feeling extra generous, check out patreon.com/comedianmtg. You get super awesome perks like having your name in the show notes at the end of the show. You get to be in our Patron exclusive channel on the Discord, which is always bumping with some of the smartest people in cEDH that I know. It's really, really awesome to be able to do this over and over again, and it's all because of the support of people like you. So thank you guys so much, and hope you all have an amazing week. Peace.